Welcome back to the Evangelical Dark Web. We are doing another live stream. It's been a while since we've done a live stream, correct? I don't think we've done one this month.
No, we did one sometime before the primary. I think it was the Jordan Peterson one. So
Okay,
second one.
we did do the Jordan Peterson one, and apparently after we did the Jordan Peterson live stream, a bunch of other content creators jumped on the Jordan Peterson. I don't want to say bandwagon, but they kind of followed in our wake, or in more specifically your wake, because this was more of your passion project
Yeah,
than it was my own.
It's kind of like the gift that keeps on giving, because as soon as that we were kind of right on the Dave Rubin sit down, then you have then he does this stupid message to the church, which not to get ahead of ourselves on the subject matter, but when Christian Post wrote an article, they cited a liberal uh I presumably liberal magazine called Relevant. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Relevant magazine is a very liberal, charismatic magazine.
Yes, and surprisingly, the person that wrote it basically said it was 10 minutes of him saying you need to do better, and that just reminded me of the Disney Plus
Captain America,
Captain America.
yeah, whatever that's called. Sam and the
Yeah,
Winter Soldier and whatever. Falcon
and
and
when
Winter Soldier.
it's like you need to do better, Senator, and that's basically that just that's 10 minutes of what Peterson did to the church, and now then other creators jumped on that.
Yeah,
Concept.
John Harris did.
Yeah,
I don't know if Protestia did or not,
Doug
but
Wilson I think touched it.
Doug Wilson.
Maybe.
Okay, so hello, Brian Babes. Nice to see you again. We will do a live stream one of these days because I finally got back to you on that because I totally thought it's one of those replies that I totally thought I sent earlier but didn't. But yeah, so tonight we're going to have a larger discussion about Christian media, and I'm going to make the case that Christian Post is worse than the Gospel Coalition. So that is on the agenda for tonight. And we got a nice catalog of articles to go through, specifically content that I've written about this year, because if Gospel Coalition writes something that's absurdly bad, I jump on that. Everyone jumps on that. A.D. Robles jumps on that. John Harris might jump on that. Reformation Charlotte, which now calls themselves Dissenter, will jump on that, or Protestia will jump on that. So if Gospel Coalition screws up, people are there to pounce on them. They will get ratioed on social media. But if Christian Post does something similar, very little coverage of that, and I think that should weigh in to the success of online discernment ministries, as well as the different, because I think we have successfully defeated Gospel Coalition. And just to put it in comparison, I guess the first thing I want to talk about is which one's actually bigger? Who is actually bigger? And the answer to that question is, I've just looked this up. The Gospel Coalition is a significantly larger website than Christian Post. And I was actually pretty shocked by that because Christian Post is a very news gathering website. So you think they would have more traffic because they have significantly more articles. I would say that their staff is perhaps even larger, and it's a larger organization for sure. And they have, ad revenue and other streams. So you would think that Christian Post would actually be a larger website because of their ads, because of their content is less niche. But the Gospel Coalition, despite the fact that their content is more niche, it is more marketed towards pastors than Christian Post is. Christian Post is marketed to a general audience.
Yeah, it's a general news site with a Christian spin.
But the Gospel Coalition is heavily marketed towards pastors. It is heavily marketed towards people that are in some volunteer or leadership capacity within a church, within a generally reformed church, or perhaps a broader brush would be complementarian church or patriarchal church. That is who the Gospel Coalition really markets themselves to. They market themselves to complementarian evangelicals. Who does Christian Post market themselves to? They market themselves to ecumenical Christians. So you would think,
typically Protestant, though.
Typically Protestant, but they do coverage of Catholic and Eastern Orthodox events. So you would think with the more narrow audience, the Gospel Coalition would have a smaller website, but the Gospel Coalition has a significantly larger online footprint than Christian Post. I thought that was really interesting to look up. So just because I noticed that the live stream numbers are starting to pick up, don't forget to send in chat. We love live chat, and we'll have some other guests on this evening, perhaps. So just stay tuned for that as well. So that's kind of what I wanted to start out by saying. So the Gospel Coalition is significantly bigger, but are they a bigger threat?
Well, I think the reason they're bigger is because of the star power that they have. Obviously, if you're looking at some of their names, Sam Albury, Joe Carter,
Tim
uh,
Keller.
Tim Keller, Ray Ortlund, um, Karen Swallow Pryor. So, I mean, and they have a podcasting network, which probably feeds a lot into it. Again, it goes back to they have bigger names, so you have bigger commentators on your staff, so to speak, or regulars. So that
Now, as far as regulars for Christian Post goes, they have Richard Land, former head of the ERLC. They have Michael Brown, who's very much a
Messianic Jew who,
no,
oh,
Michael Brown is NAR adjacent, New Apostolic
yeah,
Reformation adjacent, and he's very close to that. He's a bit of an apologist for people like Bethel Church, and otherwise they have like their own reporters and stuff like that. Gospel Coalition is somewhat more similar in some ways. A website that falls in between Gospel Coalition and Christian Post would be Ed Stetzer's Church Leaders, which is a very terrible website, very much in favor of side B theology, which I should do a deep dive article video on, because if you ever see like videos where I'm sharing my screen of my browser and there's a bunch of tabs open, some of the tabs are on stories that I'm archiving for like a later date when I want to do a deep dive on them. But in this case, we got a lot of tabs to go through because I've done exactly, I believe, 5 articles on each of these websites. And some of these articles also have corresponding videos. I've done 5 articles on the Gospel Coalition this year, and I've done about 5 articles on Christian Post roughly this year. And I'm just going to talk about this year. I think it is important to recognize a time scope, because if we're talking about who's historically a bigger threat, who has historically been a bigger threat, I would say the Gospel Coalition has historically been a bigger threat to the church. But if we're talking about who is a bigger threat in this moment right now, I would say Christian Post is a bigger threat. And going forward, I would say Christian Post is a much bigger threat. So there is a past, but I want to put the scope of this debate on 2022 and potentially beyond, because I think a lot of things have changed over at the Gospel Coalition that substantially changed the outcome of this question. And among those changes are the fact that the Gospel Coalition is no longer doing their Together for the Gospel conference. This was a pretty big deal for the Gospel Coalition as an organization, that they don't have enough clout to successfully throw an annual conference. That to me is a huge blow. The Gospel Coalition is also founded by Tim Keller. Now, Tim Keller is at the end of his life. Now, I don't think he's dying anytime remotely soon, but it was very
sunset
much
years.
speculated that, he had stage 4 cancer, and people thought he was dying at the beginning of the year. And in the beginning of the year, when everyone thought Tim Keller was on the cusp of dying, Tim Keller's out there promoting false gospel after false gospel. He's promoting Stephen Colbert as an example of promoting the gospel. Now, he didn't put that in the Gospel Coalition's website, but I imagine because of the imminent leadership change that the Gospel Coalition could end up seeing, that this could also hurt their future influence as well.
I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with I mean, some of their articles seem very subdued. Like they're not touching a lot of the political stuff that like a Christian Post might touch. So I think that's part of it. And yeah, you have a couple of the names
And we're going
that
to talk
do,
about that. We're going to talk about the
but
shift in their content because I think
but
Gospel
that's
Coalition has completely restrained itself.
yeah, it kind of appears restrained, and kind of subdued. Like you're not touching a lot of landmines. And again, some of them do, like the Joe Carter or the Sam Albury probably is a walking toucher of
I would say
landmines. But
Trevin Wax. That's a Gospel Coalition author that should come to mind for this conversation. So again, don't forget to send live chat as we go through it. And we're gonna go through another tab here. We're gonna get that ready because we are going to go through my archive of articles that I've written. So we're first going to start out with the Gospel Coalition articles. I got 4 of each pulled up. I think I've done 4 Gospel Coalition articles this year and 5 Christian Post articles, but we're only going to talk about 4 of them at the moment. So this was the first one. Let's actually go in chronological order. So the first one is the Gospel Coalition doesn't want you sharing woke preacher clips. So that is our first article to talk about. The Gospel Coalition doesn't want you sharing woke preacher clips. So what do you say to that?
yeah, I mean that's kind of like, oh yeah, don't talk about it, sweep it under the rug. Unity for the sake of unity.
And this was because of woke preacher clips. This was obviously more of a video than an article, but just to read a line from the article, this is Trevin Wax, by the way.
So
Social
this, yeah,
media accounts now feature the most outlandish moments from preachers or teachers who belong to another camp or tribe. Some of these point the spotlight on crazy fundamentalists, while others root out the most woke. In either case, we're introduced to preachers who seem determined to live up to the worst caricatures. At times, we see clips from charismatic megachurch pastors delivering inspirational drivel rather than sound biblical teaching. The intended reaction, it appears, is to name and shame bad preachers or to shake one's head in pity or disgust. Even worse, in many cases, sermon excerpts become ammunition for ongoing battles. Each clip becomes another piece of evidence that the evangelical church is quickly becoming woke or that evangelicals are becoming white nationalist. That was so before Christian nationalist became like the
boogeyman.
the boogeyman.
Oh,
Even
I
well known
kind of
and respected pastors with many years of experience, men like John MacArthur, David Platt, I love how it just equates the two as if they're equatable. They're not, are
30 years
subject to
straight.
the forces of online dissemination. MacArthur becomes an example of being anti-religious liberty, and David Platt an example of wokeism, all because they've said, perhaps sloppily, have been weaponized against them to cast doubt on the rest of their Bible teachings. So again, this is largely had to do with the context of David Platt being called out and John MacArthur not being in favor of blanket religious liberty, because religious liberty blanketly applied is, in essence, advancing paganism. So that was this was in response to John MacArthur, but it also tied into the fact that a lot of stuff going on with David Platt at the time. So see if that doesn't work as well. So obviously a lot of stuff going on during the context of this. So that's just video number 1. I would say this might be the most egregious evangelical, or not evangelical dark web. This one might be the most egregious Gospel Coalition article of this year. And the reason why I say that is because they're directly trying to weigh in on online spiritual warfare, and it's just a complete fail in the process. They're not tangentially trying to talk about a subject of cultural significance. They're actively in failing to combat and weigh in on ecclesiastical battles. So this is definitely one of the worst articles that they published this year. It was rightly panned by a bunch of online discernment ministries. Just trying to get my ducks in a row because I think I want to do this in chronological order moving forward. And in this case, chronological order going forward now goes to Christian Post. Christian Post promotes Dottie Lewis as model urban church planter. So this is a Christian Post fluff piece article about Dottie Lewis. And if you look at Christian Post daily, they write fluff piece articles on pastors all the time, false teachers, you name it. And I don't even cover a fifth of the bad promotion of false teachers that they do. I don't even cover a fifth of it. So obviously not, because this is like one of the only articles where I make a mention of it. So with that said, Dottie Lewis was the former director of the Send Network. So he was in charge of Send Network spending, church planting for the Southern Baptist Convention, and specifically the North American Mission Board. So Dottie Lewis had a very significant role to play in the Southern Baptist Convention. He had a very significant role to play in terms of, we don't know the damage that Dottie Lewis has caused the church at this moment. We don't know, because the woke churches he has planted or funded, we're only going to know that years down the line. We don't exactly, you can tell us all about the NAM funding, and you can dive into that.
Well, we can't. We don't
that.
know what the church plant numbers are, and they didn't even. I don't think they even released that at the SBC convention.
Well, I think they have raw church numbers posted, but we don't know how many of those churches are actually funded by the North American Mission Board versus signed up versus were Southern Baptist church plants. So there's a different layer of transparency that we don't have for Southern Baptist church plantings numbers. But among what we do know is that the Southern Baptist Convention is planting churches that don't align with the Southern Baptist Faith and Message 2000. They are planting churches that are egalitarian. They are planting churches that are associated with other denominational structures, like the Association of whatever ARC stands. Association of Related Churches, I think, is what ARC stands for, because it doesn't stand for Reformed, because that is the brainchild of Chris Hodges of Church in the Highlands, or is it of the Highlands, in Alabama. So that's kind of what that's about. But Dottie Lewis is a hyper woke pastor that's being, who left the Southern Baptist Convention, or at least the North American Mission Board, to do his own thing. And it's being celebrated, and he's being celebrated in this article. So this happened, the first Gospel Coalition article happened January 25th. This happened January 27th. Just for time. So the next month, the Gospel Coalition's cringe movie takes Don't Look Up. This was a Friday article I did, I guess. And you've seen Don't Look Up, right? In fact, that movie was so offensively bad. The movie Don't Look Up. It got nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards. It got nominated for Best Picture out of 10 movies. It was definitely the worst movie, because if the left can't meme were made into a movie, it would be Don't Look Up. And in the article, I note that we grew up on Adam McKay comedies, and he was the director of that movie.
I've seen most of them.
I don't know if I've seen most of them at this point, but because he's made a lot of movies since. But Adam McKay, made some classic comedies, and then he comes out with Don't Look Up, and it's a complete turd. And this movie is basically, or this article is basically a cringe take about.
I mean, Don't Look Up is kind of the South Park episode where Butters writes the book, and it becomes this bestseller and a sensation because everyone wants to interpret the book. And it's like the poop that could, or something like that, and everyone wants to interpret what the book means and how it resonates with their view, and that's kind of what Don't Look Up became in our cultures. Everyone wants to interpret the movie through their lens rather than just saying that the book is poop or that the movie is poop.
Right. And this movie actually got a lot of praise, particularly by Christian content creators, because of Timothy Chalamet's character's prayer at the end. Because Timothy Chalamet played a character who grew up evangelical, specifically evangelical, left the faith, then but still kind of has developed his own faith to fight, despite the fact that he's consistently fornicating in the movie. I digress. But so I view that as a fake faith, and I kind of view it in lines of the Psalms that talk about, on the day of calamity, you will pray and God will not hear your prayers because of how wicked you are. So I kind of thought that's how that prayer in that movie resonated with me. And the Gospel Coalition, and here's what I wrote as in response: not every pop culture experience needs to be an object lesson for our faith, and certainly not every movie review needs to have a faith message woven into it. If the Gospel Coalition, more specifically its writer Israel Song, I don't know how to pronounce Soong, wants to do a movie review, do that, but let's not dress up a poor review and call it an article about evangelizing. So I kind of roasted it like that. So, and we got another movie review on the list.
I mean, bad movie reviews aren't necessarily anything new. I mean, there's an entire YouTube, like EFAP is entirely, generated 10-hour streams every week.
That sounded like a Friday article I could do, which just shows how lack for content. Like the Gospel Coalition's been entirely tame in 2022. After they got roasted for going after woke preacher clips, Trev and Wax got roasted for going after woke preacher clips. You'll see a dramatic decrease in the aggressiveness of their articles. Now, their video content is a little bit different. I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So let's just move on in chronological order. I do believe, okay, so that's May. Okay, now we're in April. This is an April article about the Gospel Coalition. April 1st, April Fool's Day. Cringe. The Gospel Coalition talks about Bruno. And I did a video on this. 80 Robles did a video on this as well, right after I did a video on this or something like that. I'm like, wow, we did an article video on the same thing at the same time. So we both jumped on this for sure. And that the Gospel Coalition wanted to talk about Bruno. And it completely got the movie wrong, because Encanto is a very well-renowned movie made by Disney. I believe it won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature, which I believe is the impetus for this article, is that it won the Oscar for Best Animated Feature. So just going back to this article, this is an article trying to make Bruno a Christ-like figure in the movie. And if you've seen the movie, Bruno is a abject failure in masculinity. He is an effeminate man incarnate. Like, this is a guy who has rejected responsibility his entire life almost, or at least for a significant portion of his life. He has rejected responsibility and has gone underground, living between the walls of the house and scavenging food and befriending rats instead of trying to find a wife, start a family of his own, or play a leadership role in his own family, because the movie is about the failure of the matriarchy. So
there's a Christian message in there somewhere.
There is a Christian message in there somewhere, and the Gospel Coalition does not find it. Instead, they make the effeminate male lead in the movie a Christ-like figure when he is not, just because he's a prophet, or not a prophet, just because he can see into the future, and then people don't like what he has to say when he tells them bad things are going to happen. They don't want to hear that. And and the Gospel Coalition uses that to say that he's a Christ-like figure, but the reality is he is a man who has rejected masculinity. He's rejected responsibility, and that's the character's message. And they're trying to make that a Christ-like comparison, and it just does not compare. So, very strong feelings about that one, and that was just such a bad take by the Gospel Coalition. And it compares Bruno to Jesus in Mark 6:4 when Jesus visits his hometown. How can we see and this is what I write, how can we see parallels to Christ in a man who rejects labor, accountability, and headship? In Christ, we see a perfect man. In Bruno, we see a child in a grown man's body. It's no wonder that a Gospel Coalition writer sees Christological parallels in Bruno because Big Eva culture is rampant with effeminacy. Yeah, that's a pretty good line. This is yet another cringe attempt to relate to the culture by Big Eva. And that's how I kind of conclude that article. And Paul says, reminds me of Christian magazines in the 80s that tried to adapt any pop culture phenomenon or figure to Christian doctrine. And I didn't live in the 80s, so I can't attest to how true that is or is not, but that's just something to keep in mind. The trend kind of continues, and the thing is, I could do this a lot more competently if I wanted to devote my content creation to focusing on like messaging in movies. I could do that pretty well, but as you can see, these people cannot do that well because they suck at watching movies. They just are not good at watching movies the way I'm good at watching movies, which I know sounds pretty egotistical, but I mean, they if you see the Jesus character in Bruno, you just did not watch that movie accurately
I mean, a
whatsoever.
lot of people have a teddy bear Jesus, so that's kind of,
Right.
they'll see Bruno as like a teddy. I mean, he's a teddy bear.
Right. So that is cringe article. So that's that was the third Gospel Coalition article out of 4, and we've only done one Christian Post article. This one is May 5th. Our last Gospel Coalition article was May 29th. So May 5th, I wrote this article. Christian Post promotes Soros-backed immigration reform. And this was a little quick article that I did. And the gist of this article is that the Christian Post wrote an article promoting amnesty. And I could have done a follow-up on this article, but I felt like I just wrote this article. And Christian Post published, I believe, last week another article calling for amnesty. It was a Southern Baptist pastor who wrote this article calling for the Dream Act, calling for
some kind of
border security.
bipartisanship or something.
Yeah, it was about bipartisan immigration reform.
I don't trust any North Carolinian who says I think my senators have done a great job. No, both your senators are turds. They both suck. And Ted Budd is going to be like an excellent replacement for Burr. So
okay, is he based?
Better. Like you're getting a Freedom Caucus guy in place of a Rhino. So yeah, I mean,
who else? You know who's based in North Carolina?
Mark Robinson.
Mark Robinson, who I believe has a real come to Jesus story. One of these days, I'm going to try to reach out and interview Mark Robinson, who's the lieutenant governor of North Carolina, and he is based. So I like that guy. So I want to see more of that guy. So this is an article calling for amnesty. It's written by Derwin Gray, the pastor of Transformation Church in South Carolina, not to be confused with prosperity preacher Mike Todd's Transformation Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Just to be clear. And, anyone who is supporting the Dream Act is de facto supporting amnesty. We got to be clear on that. If you support the Dream Act, you're supporting amnesty. And I draw a hard line on that. No Dream Act.
the sad part is it's basically just bid against yourself because Democrats, I mean, they didn't even want to negotiate with Trump on the Dream Act because it's, I mean, their mindset is Alexander the Great. I will not negotiate what is already mine. And the Democrats aren't going to negotiate the Dream Act because they think it's already theirs. It's already the law. So, I
Yeah,
mean,
because we're not deporting dreamers. So, despite the fact that they don't have citizenship. So, this is May 29th. The Gospel Coalition wants Southern Baptists to fund abuse payout program. And this is a generic Southern Baptist article. Like, this could have been written on any Southern Baptist website, but it was published by the Gospel Coalition. So, the Gospel Coalition wants to fund the abuse payout program. And the Baptist Press had an article like this. What specifically happened with the abuse payout program is, I believe, it was a joint creation of it was a project of Sen Relief, which is a joint venture between the International Mission Board and the North American Mission Board. So, in effect, the Southern Baptist Convention wants to claim that it's not cooperative program money funding this program, but it is, in fact, cooperative
it's
program money
like
being
two,
divested to fund this
yeah.
program. There's like a degree of separation. So they kind of, which they're using to base that claim off of. But if it's through a program that's funded by the cooperative program, it's not exactly separated from the cooperative program. This was written by Griffin Gulledge, who's a mid-level player in the Southern Baptist Convention, but he does have bylines in the in the Gospel Coalition. And he kind of saves much of it for the end. Obviously, we could talk a lot about Jennifer Lyle and how she's a snake, but
A rich one.
a rich one. She's now going to be a millionaire, minus whatever 1/3 that Rachel Den Hollander collects. This last point is directed. I'm going to read an expert from the Gospel Coalition article. The last point is directed to my Southern Baptist brothers and sisters rather than Christians at large. Many of you are likely ready to walk away at this point, but who are you walking away from? We now know that our leaders, our money, and our institutions hurt people. Can we say with a clear conscience, I'm done? At this moment, when justice cries out, dare we walk away? This is the hour to speak up, to refuse to yield, to fight for the justice and mercy God requires of us. To walk away from the SBC now is to walk away from victims. To walk away now is to walk away from our responsibility. So that is a quote from Griffin Gulledge in the Gospel Coalition. Specifically, he's pointing out how the Southern Baptists should stay and accept responsibility for sin that they did not commit, and not only accept responsibility for sin that they did not commit, but also to fund damages for sins that they did not commit. And it kind of likens it to the Good Samaritan. It's making a lot of arguments about collective guilt that I don't think are biblical.
It's also
But
assuming that they need those churches to stay in to have the money to pay out the claims when they already have the money. They don't need the churches. And like North American Mission Board can essentially fund itself for like 2 years, give or take, on what the stock market's done to them. But yeah, they have the money unless they get like $50 million settlements coming. But
yeah, and I am told that the Southern Baptist Convention's cooperative program did not pay out the $1 million to Jennifer Lyle. My source on that tells me that he believes it was an insurance company's payment of that made that payout. So an insurance company against this type of stuff, because churches have insurance for these types of sins. So it was an insurance claim that paid out Jennifer Lyle's defamation suit brought by Rachel Den Hollander. Now, speaking of which, we are at a good point to segue because Evangelical Dark Web is doing a snap poll on Church Villain of the Year. So if you're a member subscriber at evangelicaldarkweb.org, you can vote on the a snap poll on who's the Church Villain of the Year. And I mentioned Rachel Den Hollander. We've also mentioned Tim Keller of the Gospel Coalition on this stream specifically. They are two of the names that you can vote for. This is a members exclusive poll. I just want to see where our members are at when it comes to who do they think is the Church Villain of the Year. So evangelicaldarkweb.org/join is where you can go for that. So, and then Paul says, decidedly non-Christian thoughts arise in me in response to articles like that. And yeah, I can imagine, because this article was a guilt trip. It was a fear manipulative sales tactic type of article. It is trying to guilt you into staying in the Southern Baptist Convention, accepting responsibilities for sins you did not commit, despite the fact that Baptist polity is very local and keeps things on autonomous. So one local church has no business really overseeing the activities of a local church over yonder. This was a very bad article,
But
but it was
also
kind of
kind of assumes that there's this polity of, oh, someone messes up, so they just ship them off somewhere else, which was not really a pattern at all in like
not really in the Southern Baptist
200
Convention.
200 pages of names of sexual predators, some actual, some supposed, but
And if
there was not a widespread pattern of, oh yeah, you sinned, so another Baptist church hires you later down the
and
road.
Megan Basham, a Christian reporter over at the Daily Wire, which is not a Christian organization, but she was a Christian reporter over there. She even reported that where's the sense of perspective that despite how large the SBC is, their numbers of these abuse type cases are significantly lower than average. So,
Well, even like if you take a look at their refuge camps, they only had 2 reported cases in like their entire database of sexual abuse claims. They only had 2.
so I want to address this comment from Matt. So, watching from Ontario, Canada, the Gospel Coalition has a heavy influence in churches in Canada, especially with Keller. The Gospel Coalition shows a history of bad discernment on approach, modern social issues, makes me question. And you're right to question that. And I guess the point of the stream, I don't know if you've been on the whole time, but part of the case that I'm making is that the Christian Post is worse is based off current trajectory. I think the Gospel Coalition is beaten. I think we've beaten the Gospel Coalition down. They are not willing to weigh in on cultural issues nearly to the extent that they used to. They have kept it very tame in 2022. And I'm highlighting the more egregious articles that they've written. Particularly, there were 2 bad movie review takes, which were just bad, but they weren't like promoting false doctrine or false church practice. But the Griffin Gulledge article, which was pretty standard SBC article at the time, not uniquely bad, but the Gospel Coalition nonetheless furthered that narrative. And then the article at the beginning of the year that they got roasted for, condemning woke preacher clips. They went after woke preacher clips and they got roasted for that. I think a lot of the damage that the Gospel Coalition has done has already been done. I think they are not as willing to weigh in on current social and cultural impacts as they used to be. Although when Canada passed Bill C4, I think it was, basically banning reparative therapy and things like that in Canada, the Gospel Coalition finally awoke to that, despite the fact that they've been reticent on it for years. And then even more recently, Rosaria Butterfield, who wrote for the Gospel Coalition, I believe in 2014, when she condemned that practice, recanted in light of this. She retracted her statement and publicly repented for her position. So that's an interesting note as well. Again, Rosaria Butterfield, very much a big Eva figure on the issue of homosexuality.
Well, the whole, I guess, conversion or sexual orientation change efforts, I mean, whatever we want to call it, I mean, that always got a horrible rap. And then I feel like over the last couple of years, you're starting to see more, I guess, Christian figures defend the practices.
And here's another thing. The National Institutes of Health, the NIH, I believe, published a study, either that or the CDC, but it was an American institution. The American government published a study saying that there was no discernible damage done by reparative therapy. That was in 2021, around the September, August time period. I have that in reference in the book that I'm working on. That study was made in reference. So that is article number 4 for the Gospel Coalition. That's really the last highly egregious article that the Gospel Coalition has published. That's really it. That's the last of the article that they've gone into. So then we have Christian Post blames men for transgenderism, defends feminism. I did not do a video on this, but this article is, again, the article that the Christian Post published was that bad. Like, Gospel Coalition has not published anything this bad this entire year. They've published some loser effeminate takes, but they haven't published anything that is defending feminism like this article is defending feminism, attacking men. And this article was right after the election that I wrote. And, so I didn't have time to do a video on it. I was too shot to do a video on this article. So if you were on YouTube, this would be your first exposure to this article. So let me just read a quote from the article. And this article was called, "Dear Christian conservative men, please stop screwing up the trans issue." Pretty aggressive take here. It was written by Kaylee Harms at the Christian Post. And here's a quote from it. "While there were a number of bold, enthusiastic men who rose up, if we are speaking in generalities, the truth remains that as a whole, men did not experience or embody the threat of the trans agenda the same way women did. It was largely women who stepped up to the plate to fight. They did so without fanfare and at great personal cost. And the women who impressed me the most in this capacity were the women who had most to lose. The radical feminist. It's one thing to speak an unpopular truth to a crowd of people who support your position. It's another thing entirely to stand up against your own tribe." And this article goes on to celebrate J.K. Rowling as a hero in this fight, despite the fact that J.K. Rowling is not a hero at all, remotely whatsoever. She was on the wrong side of this issue for several years. And then all of a sudden, when it hurts her victim mentality, we're talking about a person that retconned Dumbledore in the Harry Potter series to be gay.
Wrote an entire book series and a movie series just to make the point.
Exactly, the Dumbledore, Secrets of Dumbledore and stuff like
Grindelwald.
that. Grindelwald, yes. So J.K. Rowling retconned the entire Harry Potter book series to make Dumbledore gay, which, by the way, if you read the Harry Potter book series, knowing that Dumbledore is gay, certain scenes in the 5th and 6th book become highly inappropriate. Just saying. Highly inappropriate. So J.K. Rowling has pandered to the woke mob for several years and then gets angry that the woke mob continues down doing what the woke mob has been promoting for several years already. Like, transgenderism was already largely supported by the time J.K. Rowling retconned Harry Potter to make Dumbledore gay. We can go back to the Democrat platform in 2012, recognized transgenderism and supported it. And, before that, the Democrat Party platform would have been in 2008. So between 2008 and 2012, the Democrats embraced transgenderism. And J.K. Rowling's up in Europe, where they have left-wing political parties. They don't have a right-wing political party in power in Europe, in the UK specifically, because, you would have had like UKIP. So you have the liberal Tories and then the liberal Labour Party vying for power. And I imagine both of those parties supported transgenderism then as well. So she's not a hero in this fight. And this article is written by a feminist author who's really trying to justify feminism.
Yeah, and as the subject matter
we haven't even climaxed yet.
Oh,
so, and here's her line about J.K. Rowling. "Perhaps one of the biggest stars Among them is the prolific author J.K. Rowling, who has stood firm at great personal cost on behalf of women. All these women understand the issue in a way most men cannot. It's intensely personal to them because the physical safety of the female sex hangs in the balance in these public policies. And this is just a giant joke because it is feminists the most who have supported transgenderism. Feminists have supported transgenderism. J.K. Rowling is a minority position in the grand scheme of feminist. She's in the minority. And she's being celebrated for being a token minority feminist who does not like feminism or does not like transgenderism. And she largely didn't like it because, this idea that she supported for several years came back to bite her in the end. She touched the stove and realized that fire was hot.
No, it
And
also plays well into the whole political soap opera, oh, liberal getting trashed by other liberals for opposing them on certain issue. So she plays well into the soap opera. They instead of pointing out, oh yeah, she's done all this stuff and getting burnt. You're getting burned by the fire you started. It's oh look at her standing strong for getting burned by the fire she started. Like
exactly, you're not a victim. You are an object lesson. There's a
and
difference.
kind of Matt Walsh kind of
And
mansplained to her a little bit, but
we're gonna talk about the Matt Walsh thing as well as Jason Whitlock. This article goes after Jason Whitlock and Matt Walsh. So when Matt Walsh, I'm reading the article again, and the reason why we're doing more in-depth coverage of this article as opposed to the others is I wanted to do a video on this article, but I was not in the shape to do a video on this article when I wrote this article. So when Matt Walsh, the political rights provocateur extraordinaire, decided to release a documentary about the trans phenomenon early last month, I admittedly had mixed feelings about it. On one hand, I was thrilled that someone with Matt Walsh's degree of influence was finally caring enough to expose the barbarism of the gender industry. Really? Finally caring enough? I just got to pause right there. Like, hasn't Matt Walsh been on the right side of this issue the entire time? Hasn't he also been vocal about this issue the entire time?
I mean Matt Walsh's whole rise
Cer-
to prominence comes
Certainly
from the fact
before
that
J.K. Rowling.
well, Matt Walsh's big thing is he kind of took up a lot more of these cultural fights that the Daily Wire just wasn't going to touch. And,
Well,
he kind of went off the reservation a little bit as opposed to just
I
doing the
mean,
same shows as everyone else.
the other thing about Matt Walsh is, he makes bad takes for a living. Like his Twitter used to be really based takes, like trad cath takes. And then if it wasn't based trad cath takes, it'd be like ancillary bad takes on like, hating waffle fries or whatever. It'd be like that. Takes where he was objectively wrong on.
Well, and, he's taken up a lot of the fights that the others haven't. He's also kind of like
Exactly.
a professional troll in many ways.
And I like
And
trolling. I think we gave him Activist of the Year once. Or maybe I did that over at Knock Report, but he's a very good activist.
and the other thing, I mean, he did do like how many others at Daily Wire are gonna do the whole like I think he did a porn should be illegal thing. So I
Yeah.
mean, how many
And
others
he
at
took a
Daily
lot of
Wire are
heat
gonna
for that position. And it's a mainstream Christian nationalist position. So, and he took a lot of heat for that. So, the fact that she's acting like Matt Walsh is finally addressing this issue and he was on the right side of this issue long before J.K. Rowling woke up to it, it's just an asinine take. I welcome the invitation to long forbidden discourse. I'm overjoyed to see eyes open. And it's always a good thing when men police their own. This film is a blessing and a balm to so many. The few clips I have seen are excellent and satisfyingly comedic. He is doing good and important work that resonates with the masses. This is a major victory. But there's a but here, of course. If I'm honest, I also found myself a bit troubled by his approach to the problem and to the woman warring on the front lines against it. As a friend brilliantly put it, I get the sense that he sees the transgender issue as being more about the emasculation of men than about the erasure of women. There's a difference between speaking truth to own the libs and speaking truth to protect the innocent. So I gotta say, like, men should be protecting women, but are women innocent on the transgender issue?
No, absolutely not, because that's entirely like this is the logical ends of feminism from the very beginning. Is if you're
Right.
interchangeable, then and again the race emasculization masculinizing men is erasing is the erasure of women. I mean, they're basically the same thing because when you're basically, men go down, women go up, you're left on the same you're left with, e- equity, so to speak.
Right. So, you got first it's like men and women are interchangeable. Then it's like women are kind of like, basically the end goal of feminism is to make women androgynous and men effeminate. So they both kind of end up being the same. Right. And that includes the emasculation of men. That includes that. Feminism is already trying to erase what femininity was, and to a large degree has succeeded at that by making women so dedicated to focusing on careers and putting off natural uh, milestones for women and putting that off. And things that, I'm pretty sure studies after study would show that women who, are stay-at-home moms are pretty happy. Uh, and generally speaking, they love it. And certainly my wife does. But these things that are natural to that women enjoy and in pursuit of career or the have it all mentality, you can do both. And not everyone can do both
So the
career
other
and
thing is
children.
your window is much smaller than a guy's window, where
Right. I
guy
mean,
in his mid to
Eddie
upper 30s.
Murphy can still pop out kids, but there is a window for women and fertility and stuff like that that men don't exactly share. And I just want to get to some chat here. So the revolution is eating its own, and that's exactly how I feel about J.K. Rowling. Let her get eaten by it,
But that's
and
I
maybe
mean
that
every
and letting her get eaten by it will probably lead to her repenting rather than hailing her as a hero for taking a nominally based position. And another comment by Matt: having J.K. Rowling as a reasonable voice in women's issues is like having Dave Rubin to be an example of conservatism. I agree with that as well. And we've done the Dave Rubin live stream, so we don't need to beat that dead horse. And then Paul notes that he pushed Christy Noem's buttons on the trans sports issue because guess what? Christy Noem, speaking of Dave Rubin, because Dave Rubin had Christy Noem on to talk about saving women's sports, despite the fact that Christy Noem vetoed a bill that would have done just that in 2021, which Matt Walsh got on her for. So Matt Walsh has actually been more interested in saving women's sports than most women have. And by most, I mean overwhelming, because how many stories do you hear? And this is a point I make in the article, and maybe I should just read my own words. But the idea that men notoriously do not care about women's sports. Do you watch women's basketball?
Mhm.
No.
Or
Do you even like women's basketball? Do you even like women's women's MMA? I think is the most competitive to men's MMA, not in terms of like skill ability, but in terms of watchability. I
watchability
think
because they put it in between the male fights, and the female fighters are often not saying amateurs, but very amateur to some extent, because sometimes they're just like
I think there's more of a gap between the better fighters and the worst fighters. That's why Ronda Rousey was finishing off women in like 15 seconds, is because there was a huge gap between the best and the not so best. But the women's mixed martial arts divisions have substantially improved, and I would say they caught up with Ronda Rousey, and that's why Ronda Rousey is in the WWE now. Is because the competition level stepped up a lot because of she's a trailblazer. Give her credit for that. But I'd say women's mixed martial arts is on watchability is most on par with men's mixed martial arts, and you don't really see that in any other sport. So that being said, you're asking men to take more of an interest in defending women's sports than women are. If you understand my point, women aren't that interested in defending women's sports. How many instances have you seen where women were cheering a man winning in a woman's event. I think that has happened far more
I
than
mean, it generally is the women
hesitant
cheering it.
post facto complaining that they lost. I mean, I believe there are videos out there where, you know, the person who came in third place, the two trannies, is celebratory of, you know, this achievement. And then there are instances where women are like rightly indignant that this happened to them, but they're indignant after the fact. And I understand that they're indignant after the fact because, you know, you still got to compete, and, you can't just raise a stink before the event. Olympic curling.
My man. This guy gets it.
This
This guy
guy, Montana Viking, does in
especially
fact
those,
get it.
especially those, like, Sweden, like, Scandinavian countries, this guy gets it. I mean, the
But
Montana Vikings,
that
like,
guy does in fact get it. You are winning the chat section, sir. but yes, you
and
got
they're
me off.
fully clothed, so,
It's not sleazy, but there is just a natural beauty there that, those athletes are generally more pretty because they don't like destroy their bodies in pursuit of athleticism, like, say women's weightlifting, which is also dominated by men. So I had a point about that in this article. I don't think I need to read that anymore. And I think we covered that. So this is I think this is content for gatekeeping conservative websites, not really combating an ideology. And I'm talking about the Christian Post article. And it then goes after Jason Whitlock as well. So let's read that section. The truth is that Fearless Women wrote a lot of Walsh's talking points and championed them for years at their own expense. But while he soars to number one in ratings and internet fame, some of those women remain silenced by every social media channel available. I could ignore this more easily if he and his buddies weren't participants in the silencing. Recently, Walsh and others took aim specifically at J.K. Rowling, and rather than applauding her moral courage, they condemned her political leanings and took potshots at feminism as a whole. In a stunningly tone-deaf moment, author Jason Whitlock chimed in to assist in the silencing, telling Rowling to fall back and support men. You're not built for this conflict. Now, I don't need to weigh in on those, because let's just go to the context of what this was about. The context of this was that Matt Walsh and Jason Whitlock were going after cowards who so happened to be feminist, who backed down and apologized after coming out against transgenderism. They backed down and apologized, and Matt Walsh went after them for being cowards. And this author here at the Christian Post is attacking Matt Walsh for attacking the cowards who backed down in fighting transgenderism. I don't see the moral equivalence. I don't see the point that she's trying to make. Because if you read those tweets by Matt Walsh and Jason Whitlock, they're about women who backed down and committed cowardice. J.K. Rowling's trying to defend them, basically using much of the points of this article. But at the end of the day, what they did was indefensible. You stood up for the truth, and then you backed down at the slightest moment of resistance. What exactly is meritorious about that?
but they were defending the one singer who acquiesced on the pronouns. It's like, okay, if
I believe that's the context.
if you're already doing that, I'm not going to defend you.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, you've already caved.
And I mean,
you're bending the knee, but you're not prostrated.
And again, Matt Walsh was right on this issue long before J.K. Rowling was. I don't get where she's getting that women were the pioneers of opposing transgenderism. No, they weren't. The Christians were. I don't know if the Catholic Church had it. It's funny that the Catholic Church will have positions on issues long before evangelicals will. Specifically, abortion is one of those instances. In vitro fertilization is one of those instances as well, that the Catholics have a kind of like a robust, I don't want to say catechism, because that might not be the most Catholic word to use, but you know what I'm saying? They have a robust policy system on issues in a lot of ways, way ahead of Protestants. They might be slow to respond on other things, but on things related to sexuality, they're kind of ahead on. And meanwhile,
sex abuse.
There's the Council of Manhood and Womanhood. They put out the Nashville statement back in like 2015, 2016, or maybe that was 2017. The Nashville statement came out in 2017, which I believe condemned transgenderism. And, right after Obergefell, transgenderism became a huge deal. Because after gay marriage was unilaterally via pen stroke became fiat law in the United States, transgenderism rose up. You had the bathroom bill fights and stuff like that. So was Matt Walsh wrong on those fights?
I mean, Jenner became the face of that.
Bruce Jenner, 2015 as well.
So it became a lot more mainstream when you had a celebrity face to put behind it. And and again, who watches the Keeping Up with the Kardashians?
Women.
Not dudes.
Not dudes, unless they're like, I don't know, into the plastic boobies.
I don't even.
So I don't know what man watches Keeping Up with the Kardashians. So, yeah, even if it's like
Kanye might.
Yeah, he needs to know what's going on in his marriage or what's going on in the marriage he is no longer in.
I thought I saw a rumor that might be back together, but he needs to keep up with what's happening across the street. So.
Yeah, that's a weird situation. So another clip from the article: in the left silences them for saying men are men, them referring to the radical feminists. The right silences them for failing to march in ideological lockstep with them on other issues. Only compliant women are permitted to speak, which sounds pretty base, by the way, and why feminism exists. And that's why feminism exists in the first place.
Well, it's the paradox, the compliant woman doesn't speak at all.
Okay. Just as the political left loves to place the blame for all the world's problems on the shoulders of old white men, the political right loves to do the same to feminism. Cancel culture exists in both directions. And I don't even, are we even at the, so there it is. There it is. And let me read the next line because we're going to, because that's kind of a boom goes the dynamite moment here. And I'm going to explain why, but I'm going to read this last excerpt. Love it or hate it, we need true feminism, the kind that seeks dignity, not revenge, the kind that insists on fairness, not just power. Someone needs to advocate on behalf of women. And when it comes to the trans agenda, few have done more in this regard than radical feminists. The Christians have done far more, but I digress. They should be thanked and applauded, not silenced and demeaned. While Walsh and others may be inclined to throw stones at these women, my 7 years working alongside them tells me there's a lot more fruitful to pick up these. It's a lot more fruitful to pick up these stones to try to build a few bridges with them. We may even find that they have something meaningful to say, and we may have something important to learn. And we did the live stream on this, and you talked about how feminism was inherently anti-biblical from the inception. In this article, I make a reference to the anti-feminist manifesto that you wrote, with the Simone Beauvoir or whatever her name is.
Yeah, Beauvoir, and she was, trying to think. She was the one that basically said, a consent-based sexual morality, men and women. I mean, again, when you have men and women being interchangeable,
then homosexuality just comes in naturally.
Yes,
and you cannot separate transgenderism and homosexuality. You can't separate the two ideologies. You can't separate the two practices. It's in the acronym. It's in their acronym. It's been in their acronym for over 14 years now. It's been in their acronym. So, but when you go back through history, you can't separate feminism from homosexuality. And that's the history that you pointed out in your article and that we did the live stream on that. You can't separate homosexuality from transgenderism, but looking back in history, you cannot separate homosexuality from feminism. Therefore, by the transitive property, you cannot separate feminism from transgenderism.
No, especially since we're not just talking about Spartan bromance in the
Right, which was more of like a it's okay to rape kids culture that the Greeks had, which is odd. But and your article on like the Palestinian question, uh, you make reference to that as well, that they kind of had that Greco rape culture in Palestine,
yeah,
right?
where they will like
And
sexually abuse, like even like if they like police arrest a homosexual man in Palestine, they'll sexually abuse them and whatever that means, because
and
it wasn't detailed.
right. So what this article by Christian Post did, and and we gotta punch it right in the mouth. They just made a moral equivalency between wokeness and anti-feminism. They drew a moral equivalency between two uh, ideologically opposed ideas. But here's the thing: you can't have wokeness without feminism, especially radical feminism. So she made a moral equivalency that does not exist, and that's the thesis or the climax of the article is this line that let me just read it again. Uh, just as the political left loves to blame all the world's problems on the shoulders of old white men, the political right loves to do the same to feminism.
I
That
mean,
is the climax of the article.
maybe to rebuff your entire point for this whole video, maybe this is like how you get into the Gospel Coalition is you write some articles like this. So maybe Gospel Coalition's worse, and this is the tryout article.
I think the tryouts are the ERLC blog. Like that's like your tryout. But this was a Christian Post article, and you would think that Christian Post would be more conservative because oftentimes they are. But this is horrendously bad. This is worse than anything the Gospel Coalition's published this year. So let's just go through some comments. I'm assuming these two are related. Yes, brothers. Worse, they're Marylanders. Yes. Apostle Paul seems to have no problem with canceling bad teaching and calling out names. I fully agree with that.
He might have also had a problem with excommunication, right?
No notification as usual. I don't know how to
Yeah, I
solve
don't
that
know.
issue.
Does YouTube even send out
I got a
notifications?
notification because I have like a channel that I have like my personal account that's subscribed to this just so I can see things the way you guys see things because also to get high on my own supply. But and I don't know what Horse Island is. Is that like a oh are you talking about Assateague Island in Maryland? Then yes, I am familiar with that. So a lot of mosquitoes there. So that was the third Christian Post article out of 4 that I want to go over. And we went in that more in depth because I wanted to do a video on this article, but it was right after the primary election. So I did not have the state of mind to do a video. I was just shot and on 3 hours of sleep. It wouldn't have looked good. And cringe. This is article number 4. This came out earlier this month, July 16th, 2022. The previous article was also July. It was July 20th. Oh, so I did these out of order. July 16th, 2022. So I did these out of order. Cringe. Christian Post claims moral obligation to defend Israel.
And they had like this was kind of like a double whammy where they had like Michael Brown did his, and yours is on the Scott Phillips article, I believe.
Michael Brown is just such a trite writer. I mean,
he has a tendency to answer claims like straw man claims, like, oh, he'll answer the people that will basically say, oh, you think I worship Trump because I voted for him, or you think just because I voted Trump that means I think Cheeto Jesus saves. Like he he seems to respond to those people, and like they're not serious people, so there's
I
no.
also think he does a radio show, so he might be trying to respond to trolls or otherwise low wit people that call into his show. So let's just go through some of this. I wrote this article, not you. This was an article about it was a piece by Scott Phillips condemning the PCUSA's declaration opposing Israel as an apartheid state. And here's the thing. Here's the thing. Let me just be as upfront as I can. I don't care about the Palestine-Israel question. In fact, that question has held back American foreign policy in that region for so long that part of the success of the Trump administration was to bypass that question and to just settle some peace agreements here. And all these peace agreements were made bypassing that question because, the Palestinians are difficult to deal with. That's notorious. But I don't think that Israel is a moral country whatsoever. No matter how many PragerU videos are about Israel and how great they are, they're not a great nation. I don't think they are remotely comparable. They're not a free country. I don't even think they're the freest country in their region of the earth. They just have a different government. But we can talk about how liberal democracy has led to more tyranny than any other form of government, by and large. We can talk about that in a different stream. But I don't want to note Montana Viking saying Michael Brown really came out against Christian nationalism. And I'm not shocked by that. I don't know Michael Brown all that well because, he's one of those people who I would never kind of bring on evangelical dark web just because of, his associations. And, I don't need that kind of headache. And I don't exactly know what he brings to the table because his cultural commentary isn't very good, but he's probably the biggest writer over at Christian Post.
No, certainly the most like the one with the most longevity.
Yeah. And then Richard Land, former head of the, that was another Christian Post article response I did. I just titled it more after Richard Land because he was a former head of the ERLC. So I did another article about Christian Post that isn't in my lineup today. And that article, Richard Land basically talked about how he counseled someone that getting an abortion in under dubious life of the mother's circumstances wasn't wrong. And, this guy was the former head of the ERLC. It's like, were these people ever that pro-life? Were they ever on my level of being pro-life? And I don't think the answer has ever been yes. And you understand why Russell Moore took over, and you understand why Brent Leatherwood is the way that he is. Because, Richard Land, I don't think set the greatest example.
I mean, Michael Brown did like a May 26th where he talks about the sexual abuse scandal. So he seems to drink the Kool-Aid on that. But it's so like low IQ to some extent. It's not even worth responding to because it's like responding to someone that watches CNN for their news. I mean, you're
right. So the Scott Phillips article on the moral obligation to defend Israel, it climaxes because me, I don't write clickbait. And I was struggling to come up with a headline for this article because I wanted to talk about this article. I wanted to talk about this Christian Post article, but I was struggling to figure out how to headline it. And then I read the last sentence. I'm like, there's my headline. And the last sentence of the article is, as Christians, we have a moral obligation to stand up solidly for a Jewish state where Jews can feel safe and secure. So there it goes. There's your headline. That is a moral claim that they just made. They just added a moral obligation that is extra biblical, which is by definition legalism. You're adding a law to scripture. The Christian has no moral obligation to defend the existence of a secular, nominally Jewish state.
Oh, and to raise you. Bernard Howard over at Gospel Coalition said, "Is the land of Israel spiritually significant?" And he kind of totes the line a little bit, but overall he kind of said, it's some of the significance in the land is simply the history of itself. So you have a lot of history there, you have archaeology there. I mean, he
Religious
kind
sites.
of does the whole Jews are still the chosen people kind of thing, but then he kind of throws in at the very end a comment on how Palestinian Christians don't like Israel.
They don't.
And
Palestinian Christians also supported Assad in Syria.
They view
That's a
the
fact as well.
establishment of the state of Israel as their Nakba, which basically translates to their catastrophe. So and this guy was a Jewish believer in Christ. So a little bit more nuance over there at the Gospel Coalition on this particular subject.
So you're saying that the Gospel Coalition had a better take than Christian Post on this subject. And I think the Palestinian question is rather I don't want to say insignificant, because I just think it's too hyper focused. Whenever there's a discussion about Israel, it is always relegated to Israel versus Palestine, when it should really be more focused on the fact that Israel is a totalitarian government state in the Middle East. And I think they are highly tyrannical, and that never gets called out because reasons. And those reasons are lots of money, because there's lobbying arms. You get called anti-Semitic if you criticize Israel. And I've done articles responding to claims that opposing Israel in any way is anti-Semitic. I've done those articles before. And maybe they were also Christian Post articles.
And let's be real, trying to compare like a secular democracy type country in Israel's kind of comparable to like an average European country in that sense.
I think they're actually more atheistic than an average European country.
Yeah, on that, but like from a structure, legal, they're very similar to like your average run the mill, say like France. Like trying to compare that to a Muslim country, I mean, such a low brow thing. Well, okay, why don't you compare them to an Asian country then? Or,
right. So along those lines, there's so many misconceptions. Like, Israel only just now has its first religiously Jewish observant prime minister in Naftali Bennett. So they've had like 9 prime ministers prior to that were functionally atheist, including Benjamin Netanyahu. He was functionally atheist. So you're trying to make a moral obligation to defend a Jewish state that isn't actually Jewish in anything other than ethnicity, which we could debate that as well. Because if you look at European history and the history of steppe civilizations, and by steppe, I'm spelling it STEPPE, civilizations, the European steppes. Yeah, you can look at the history of how an entire tribe overnight became Jewish so that they would have international diplomatic legitimacy with Christian and Muslim nations. This happened in the Middle Ages. So obviously we could talk about history, but that's some of that history you're not allowed to even remotely discuss. And I get that the PCUSA is a liberal denomination. They would have opposition to Israel for the most liberal of reasons. And those most liberal of reasons would be the pro-Palestinian stance. So, and that's just run of the mill. Again, I don't think there's a Christian argument to say that Christians must fall on one side or the other, because there is no Christian argument. There is no scriptural argument to justify the existence of Israel as a nation. That does not exist. Because modern Israel is not the Israel of the New Testament or Old Testament. It is a separate nation with the same name. And of course, we can go into replacement theology, which I think is more accurately put fulfillment theology. Because, didn't Jesus say that, he could make sons of Abraham out of rocks? You know the passage I'm referring to?
Yeah, out of these sins I can call up sons of Abraham, and that's how you basically tell someone that, if you don't try to play the heritage card with Christ, because not buying it.
So Matt says, must admit I used to be more pro-Israel in the past, but last few years changed my view, reflecting on the new covenant. And I think God's elect, Old Testament and New Testament, really reflected Israel. So that I believe is the biblical position, because not all who are of Abraham are Israel, I think is another passage in Romans, right? So, and obviously Paul
even
laments for his own people.
even like the Catholics, I want to say well, I guess sanctify or whatever they make saints out of their old, like, certain characters, and pre-Christ, like, I want to say David's a saint, I think, or certainly
Really?
I think, oh, obviously Joseph, and Joseph is presumed to have died before Christ's resurrection, so
Right.
ver-
And
ver-
even Christ's ministry by extension. Uh, So here's another line from this article. By effectively accusing the entire Jewish homeland of similar evils as those perpetrated by the Nazis or the apartheid government in South Africa, the PCUSA opens the door for anti Semitic hate to live on in the United States. And then my next line was, or my response to that claim was, out of all the regimes in the Middle East, none resembled the Nazi regime more than Israel's government with their harsh lockdowns and mass vaccination program. Did any Middle Eastern country as aggressively lock down or mass vaccinate as Israel did? The answer is no. I mean, we don't really know what goes on in Syria, other than the fact that after the Syrian Arab army liberated Aleppo, they were celebrating Easter there. We know that happened. That was 2015, I think. Or very shortly into Trump's term. Maybe it was 2017, but it's been a while since I followed the Syrian civil war. So anyway, it's just such a, like, it's like they forgot the last 2 years have happened, and that Israel's been like one of the most tyrannical countries in the last 2 years. And you're getting some hate that Speedy Gonzalez is faster than Roadrunner.
I don't even know.
Looney
It's a hot
Tunes.
take, I guess.
And then here's another line from Scott Phillips, which just shows a worldview issue here. It is a poison that the Jewish people have had to deal with for generations, referring to anti-Semitism. As Christians, we need to be building systems of support to help our Jewish brothers and sisters, hold on to that, combat anti-Semitism. And especially true in our churches, where anti-Semitism has often gone unchallenged. Anti-Semitism, including anti-Israel bias, has no place in our church. It is immoral and should be routinely rejected by church leaders and community members. The church cannot go around the wagon on this again. As Christians, we have a moral obligation to solidly stand up for a Jewish state where Jews can feel safe and secure. So that's the final sentence that I read earlier. So, two things I wanted to note. Our Jewish brothers and sisters, does that in any way imply that Jews have salvation apart from Christ?
I mean, yeah, anytime you kind of uh, pull, because again, I mean, first century, if you're calling someone a friend, acquaintance, but you're calling them a brother, you're basically pulling them in part of the family. It's one thing if you are a Jew like Paul, or even to some extent Schroeder, Shriner dude and over at Gospel Coalition, calling them brothers because he can at least make that claim. But yeah, I mean, if you're just like, if you're African and saying my brother, Jewish brothers and sisters, you're kind of going off the deep end from a hermeneutic.
Yeah,
Because
I think it's kind of implied, and I think a lot of Christians don't realize that. First of all, I think the Gospel of John is very exceedingly clear that Jesus is the only way to heaven, and that includes old and new covenants, because Jesus' sacrifice is good for everyone, before Christ and after Christ. His death on the cross paid their penalties. Whether you were looking forward to the resurrection or looking back at the resurrection, that resurrection is sufficient. And I don't think enough people realize that. They kind of want to invent a new way to salvation that, for the Old Testament and then apply it to modern day Judaism, which is a entirely distinct religion from Old Testament Judaism. And it has been ever since the destruction that Jesus foretold of the Second Temple. And it's a very well documented event at that, the destruction of the Second Temple and the Jewish revolt of AD 70. So, okay, so Nicholas was just saying with his, he was just saying, making jokes about Christian Post being worse, not actually making a claim about Speedy Gonzalez or Roadrunner. I just thought since Roadrunner was in the background there that that's what he was playing off of. But Matt has an interesting comment here. No, wrong comment. Modern Israel is often reported to be the hardest to preach the gospel in, and I think that's because it's a highly atheistic society. I think it's, from what I've heard, it's a lot easier to reach Muslims because they're more theologically awake. Like they're more, I don't want to say spiritually awake, but they are more spiritually interested. And because they're more spiritually interested, you can debate theology with them. You can debate the Bible and Jesus with Muslims.
Well,
But
one thing
in an
one thing
atheistic society, you have to convince them to care before you can even debate.
Yeah, you would have to, and probably in a lot of cases like Israel, you might have to even convince them that they are sinners, because again, they might just be nominally religious. So it's kind of like preaching to any American agnostic.
Right.
And
And
one thing I touched on in the article is, a lot of Christians and Muslims might agree a lot on the morality of things, but the difference being there actually is redemption, there is regeneration, there is sanctification in Christianity that you don't really get in Islam. Islam is just okay. If you're a blight, Sharia might just call for you to be eliminated.
right. And Montana Viking says that I believe there will be a major revival in Israel in the future. And I think that's very possible, for sure. So, and then Paul says, I don't think they're keen on evangelicalism or Christian evangelism over there. And, despite the fact that they're very much willing to make a tourist industry of it. So, and again, I don't begrudge them for making a tourist industry of it. But if we want to look back at Christian history for the majority of Christendom, it has been the land of Israel Christendom has been more interested in conquering the land of Israel than it has been in creating a Jewish secular state in Israel. That's just a fact. You look at
retaking the land.
Well, first it was it was Christian land, the Eastern Roman Empire and all that. Then the Muslims took it over. Then for a while the church was interested in reclaiming the land of Israel. And then there's a brief period of time where I don't want to say Christians retook Israel, but the West, there was a brief time where the Christians did retake Israel with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, had Israel. And then afterwards, the British, I believe, had the British Mandate in Israel happened then. And then the secular state of Israel was created. So for most of Christian history, Israel has been a prize to win back from Muslim rule, not an object to create a Jewish state. So let's just address some chat here. I was playing off the road. Okay, I was correct in deducing that. The ultimate point of the gospel coalition are very bad, even if Christian Post are worse. Ray looks more like Ray than Anthony does. What? Yeah. And the reason why I'm saying that they're worse is because I think Gospel Coalition, they would not be willing to post or at least if they're willing to post this article, which I don't think they are, they're certainly not willing to post that article that we just read about defending transgenderism from feminism.
Well,
They're certainly not they would not post that article.
They might post if it's from like Joe Carter, who's like the woke
No,
McLean.
Joe Carter writes FAQ articles.
Yeah, that are pretty woke. Like he did one on replacement theory, and again, just spouting off your typical CNN talking point. Oh, it's inherently racist, xenophobic, and I go off on a thing with the base manifesto on replacement theory, and basically, it's, dare I say, origins, which, spoiler alert, it is in the Bible, kind of, but a little teaser for the future.
Oh yeah, we'll eventually do that. And another thing I want to highlight is I don't think we need to share screen anymore. So just going back, so earlier I talked about how I think Gospel Coalition is relegating a lot of their shadier content to videos, long form content, right? And part of those long form contents are like the debate series that they've been having, the good faith debates. And the reason why I've not touched that, I'll let Adi Robles touch that all day because I'm just so disinterested in watching a 50-minute debate in which the opening sides each have like 10 minutes to present an opening statements. Like it's not that it's too formal, and so it's too, come on, we need to break this up. I don't think you need 10 minutes for opening statements to make a case for criminalizing abortion. I don't need 10 minutes to make a biblical case to do that. I don't need 10 minutes to articulate that gun control is wrong and that there's an inherent right to self-defense. I don't need 10 minutes to do that, but they're giving 10-minute opening statements that are just that's too rambly. I don't feel like making content about that. I'll let Adi Robles do that. But apparently, according to his content, there's some shady things being said.
Burying the lead, so to speak.
And then we have the Gospel Coalition's TED Talk series, TGC Talks, which I think have become increasingly banal. They started out kind of, again, in 2021, Gospel Coalition was kind of raging. They have toned it down in 2022. They are tired of being ratioed on Twitter. And that's my observation.
No, maybe they're doing like the Southern Baptists. Instead of going woke, you just go pragmatist and kind of just toe the line for a bit.
And maybe you're right. Maybe that is the direction of the Gospel Coalition, is that they're already a liberal organization. They're just going to go pragmatist to keep the lights running. That's what the Southern Baptists are doing. Like Rick Warren is a very liberal guy, but he's an extreme pragmatist first. This guy's a pragmatist first, liberal second. And the Southern Baptist Convention put liberalism first for a few years now, openly, with J.D. Greear and Ed Litton. And now Bart Barber is going to take it more in a pragmatist direction. The liberals have already won. They already have institutional control. Now it's time to keep the lights running, keep the money flowing. And I think that is that trend we're also going to see at the Gospel Coalition. I think that's very good insight. But as for Christian Post, where do you see their trajectory? Because I think they're going to get worse. And one of the things we haven't even talked about is they're simping for Zelensky in the Ukrainian narrative. We haven't even talked about that because I didn't do an article on that.
Well, I mean, there's so many people jumping on that bandwagon that, Christian Post doing it is not really news, but like if someone
Michael Brown talking about let's not get morally confused about the Ukrainian situation, despite the fact that he's completely morally confused about the Ukrainian situation. And, I'm sure he had no qualms about the fact that civilian death toll in the Iraq invasion in 2003 was far higher than the civilian death toll in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, at least certainly at the time of the writing of that. And I would bet money that statistic is still held up, despite allegations of mass graves or whatever that don't really
it's
last
not very
long under
surprising.
scrutiny.
It's not very surprising that let's say a outlet that's primarily centered on faith matters is awful when it comes to talking about geopolitics and war, and very short-sighted and lacks the historical insight. And
Yeah, it's funny
not
because
their lane.
when I started out, some of what I wrote about was war. I wrote about the Syrian civil war. And in this war is actually fairly comparable, because the media at the time was very pro Al Qaeda. When it came to the Syrian civil war, they were very much pro Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda has rebranded themselves several times in Syria, so I'm using Al Qaeda loosely because they have rebranded themselves as Nusra Front, and then they've rebranded themselves from there and splinter organizations and whatnot. And then ISIS was like always a thing, and then they were the main Syrian rebel group, not these John McCain freedom fighters, or the John McCain freedom fighters were actually ISIS. So it just goes to show that most Americans, when they report on these issues, they don't have the context. They don't know how to read a map, reading a map of who controls what territory in this country. And Ukraine is kind of no different, where it's like, okay, Russian-backed separatists have controlled these regions for 8 years now, and they don't factor that into their analysis that these people have declared themselves independent countries. So in their eyes, it's a war of independence. So you have to factor that into any moral calculation.
No, that, and you could have just taken the deal and avoided this entire thing.
Yeah. You could also apply. I mean, there's a passage in scripture where it's like, "Don't rebel against the king," and Israel and the king of Judah wants to rebel against his overlords with Egypt. It's like you were told not to do that, and you did exactly that. So, and then destruction came. So it kind of rings more like that as well. So
Also speaks a lot to American meddling that often will get overlooked because
so other articles I did not comment on, but really should. So we have the bipartisanship is possible. Immigration reform should be next, written by a Southern Baptist pastor, Lawrence Yu. We made reference to this article earlier, and I didn't write an article on this because it just felt like I've already done this same exact article, and I'd just be rehashing my own material. An article, July 10th, abortion is slavery. I absolutely hate the moral equivalency of abortion and slavery, because I don't think they're morally equivalent. I think abortion is actually far worse. It is far worse to systemically kill babies than it is the fact that America inherited a system of slavery from colonial British Empire. And then America took steps to end its participation in the slave trade because of how immoral the slave trade was.
Yeah, and people always forget that invention called the cotton gin, which reignited slavery as an institution, where it was largely perceived as dying. The Constitution pretty much had poison pilled it in 1789, but then cotton gin comes around in 1815, I think. Eli Whitney, and that
No,
just
1787 was the Constitution.
no,
1789, I believe, was Bill of Rights. Yeah, you're exactly right. That when the Constitution was written and the Declaration of Independence, which at its first draft had a plank condemning slavery that was accepted by 11 of 13 colonies, but in order for the resolution to pass, it had to be unanimous. That's how the Continental Congress operated. Everything had to be unanimous, and I believe that's how the Articles of Confederation operated
I
as
thought it was
well.
9 of 13.
Maybe it was 9 of 13. It was a super majority. But for the Continental Congress, it had to be unanimous. It was hang together or die separately. That is how they rolled back then. And, and they wanted unity. So they put off the issue of slavery until the Constitution was written, and the Constitution poison pilled the slave trade as well. And America, the founding fathers wanted to do right by the system of slavery. But we also got to account for the fact that in the grand history of slavery, American slavery was not nearly as bad as other systems of slavery. Roman slavery, which the Bible confronts, was far worse. It's not even close. And there was never really a significant instance of a slave revolt in the United States. And I think part of the reason for that is the conditions weren't that bad systemically. Individual cases, yes. Individual plantations, yes. But systemically, they weren't to the level of Sicily in Roman times.
Or Mandingo and Django Unchained.
No. But yeah, Django Unchained is not the most historically accurate movie. It's a
Didn't
great movie, but
happen,
it's not
but
historically accurate. Although what they go into in the movie is Frientology, which I thought was a pretty interesting pickup for that movie. I think Frientology might have happened after the Civil War, but nonetheless, that would have been very cutting edge in the 1850s when Leonardo DiCaprio is bringing a skull onto the table for Frientology. That was very cutting edge. But so I don't think that's a Christian Post article. They had one on Disney Plus, which Disney Plus having R-rated content, which I'm like, haven't I already read this? Disney Plus breaks promise to stay family friendly, adds R-rated movies,
and it's basically
and
just the Fox Marvel.
I feel like I've
Logan.
read that same exact headline months ago
It's like,
because this
wow.
was talked about months ago, and it's like, okay, I'm not going to have a problem with Disney bringing Logan onto Disney Plus when Disney Plus has far more egregious content targeting children. And you're going to complain about an R-rated movie when they're openly promoting homosexuality and transgenderism to children in
But
their other content?
I like how they complain about Stranger Things having a bunch of F-bombs in it, and I'm just like, I don't care. It sucks. It's terrible. Like, I don't care if they curse more. It's just not good writing regardless.
And and that's the problem with like Christian film is that they write it for families. That's my thesis. This is my thesis for Christian movie industry. It would be better if they wrote the films for adults and tackled ideas that were family friendly rather than writing movies for families and dumbing down the material. I mean, you look at Marvel movies where if you look at the first Marvel movies written by Paramount, not Disney, the first Marvel movies, phase 1, Paramount, were much better than most of the Marvel movies in phase 3. Because the movies in phase 1, minus Captain America, that movie sucked. The first Avenger, that was a terrible movie. But every other phase 1 movie was written for adults. You look at The Incredible Hulk, which was disavowed, but nonetheless, I will count it with Edward Norton. Very dark, gritty Hulk movie. Then you have Iron Man, which is in many ways Robert Downey Jr., being Robert Downey Jr. So that was very much a PG-13 style adult movie. And then Thor, Thor is more of a Shakespearean drama put into a superhero setting. So again, very adult mentality. And I think Thor 1 is the best Thor movie. And then you compare it to Thor Love and Thunder, which is quoted by Chris Hemsworth as being written by the mind of a 7-year-old. And we know how that movie did in theaters. So that, I think Christian movies are the same way. You look at a movie like God's Not Dead, and here's a plug for myself. I got a review on God's Not Dead 2 coming out, which you should be excited about because that is going to be a solid review by myself, if I do say so myself, as I talk about myself. So God's Not Dead 2, written as family-friendly content, and it's just so dumbed down. It's not a good movie whatsoever, which I'll explore later. But God's Not Dead 1, again, very dumbed down. Doesn't deal with the source, or does not deal with the issues that it's tackling in a mature fashion. And you go back to the 1960s with the Star Trek original series. That was written for adults, but it was written for adults in a way that children could also watch it. So that's what Christian film needs, in my opinion. So otherwise, those are just some of the articles I could have written about Christian Post that I didn't get to write because of time or other constraints. How I have a scrapyard of ideas that just don't ever come to fruition when doing evangelical dark web. And, it happens. So, and the Arab slave trade was one of the worst.
I don't
And
know. It's hard to be
if
worse
not
when
the worst. And,
it's hard to
that's
be
probably true.
worse when you castrate the evidence so it can't repopulate. And I'm sure
Are you
you
talking about the
understand.
Mamluks?
Well, I'm pretty sure they like castrated the slaves so they didn't, repopulate. And
Then you had like the Mamluks who rebelled and who were a systematic slave mercenary group, I believe, that rebelled and took over Egypt. So, yeah, slavery in the Middle East, in the history of slavery in the Middle East, that's brutal. And then you got the Mediterranean slave trade, which may also fall into the category of Arab slave trade, where they're taking white people's slavery. America had to fight the Barbary Wars over that. And then the Janissaries, those were Turkish elite units, right? I didn't know if they were slaves or not, but they were elite units for the Ottoman Turks, if I recall. So, yeah, a lot of history that's kind of ignored and forgotten. And I think that factors into America's opinions on Israel, because we've forgotten most of Christendom actually wanted to conquer the Holy Land, not set it apart for a Jewish state. And then any commentary on like modern day wars, history is just lost. So, anyway, what do you think about my thesis that Christian Post is worse than the Gospel Coalition in terms of its current threat level and future trajectory?
I mean, they're certainly reaching more than Gospel Coalition because again, they're kind of tame. They're still maybe they're tight roping it. Again, I think pragmatist is the right way to do it, or right way to describe it, and versus
The Gospel Coalition, right?
Yes, versus Christian Post, which is kind of just Big Eva, celebratory posting, and occasionally right wing talking points, and then you get weird op-eds, which are just again very liberal and
Or they might dress up a liberal article in a book review, which that's kind of hard to write a response to a book review. So I haven't really delved into that.
yeah. I mean,
But
I saw that like they had something on Tony Evans. It's like, okay, is there anything here? No, but they don't have any of the original source. It's just a guy writing an article on an interview.
right, and let's see. If you look at Gospel Coalition, I'm more stunned by what they're silent about than what they're actually writing these days. I think their silence is rather deafening. So that's just my opinion, obviously. But I'm trying to make the case that Christian Post, I think, is worse because they are more of a news gathering organization. They promote Big Eva culture, and that's just very prevalent. And I think the Gospel Coalition is so tail between the legs at this point. They are trying to bury their bad content in long form podcasts and maybe book reviews. They're not writing the shameless articles that they used to write.
I mean, they also kind of maybe dress it a little longer, so
Right. The
might go back.
long form content to bury questionable narratives that they're trying to say. They
Like,
bury
I
in
mean,
long form content.
their current most read is House abandons support for marriage. Okay, I mean that's just a current political issue. The transformation of a transgender teen. I think that was a story out in California. I read that one. It looked like they changed the names of the identities, but I think that case in particular was the California case where the school was transgendering the child without the parents' knowledge, and then COVID lockdown happened. But I could be wrong on that. But it's a very long-winded article, and good, I guess. I mean, it wasn't objectionable, just a little long-winded. But
And then
that's their most
obviously,
read.
I brought this up in the beginning. When Tim Keller is no longer with us, I have to think that has some impact on the future influence of the Gospel Coalition. Yeah, I don't think Colin Hansen has the street cred to carry Tim Keller's reputation onward. Like, he does not have that same pull, in my opinion. And
Oh yeah, you have a lot of like I won't say orthodox pastors, but you know you have. I guess you might have your average SBC pastor who might still look up at Keller as an icon, kind of situation.
Right. I think that's a scary world where you're like 50 years down the road and pastors are quoting Tim Keller as some sort of faith hero, despite the fact that his ministry could entirely be characterized as syncretism with the world, specifically New York City.
Well, that's if he is remembered 50 years from now. Again,
I think some people will try to keep him alive. Like, how many people like, I don't know if Dietrich Bonhoeffer is really the celebratory figure that we make him out to be.
Because he was the Nazi guy, right?
Yes. Yeah. Operation Valkyrie was his downfall. So I don't know if he's really the type of figure. And C.S. Lewis also has some questionable moments, theologically speaking, as well. But he's highly regarded. So it just makes you wonder. Now, I will give C.S. Lewis some grace, as it was a more difficult time. I think we have a much easier time now when it comes to combating secular ideologies.
Yeah, because it's easy to get entangled with someone who you didn't know he wrote something.
Information's at our disposal, so I believe there's less of an excuse. But so anyway, and because I believe evangelical dark web should be more of an I want it to be more of a news gathering direction. So I think the trajectory of evangelical dark web is going to go more in the direction of Christian Post in terms of what the website will look like. I am not interested in being a podcast network. I'm not interested in that. That's what Gospel Coalition is. I'm more interested in doing obviously the YouTube channel commentary and stuff like that, because certain stories just need video coverage of. And then writing and news gathering. Like, that's the direction I want to go in. I don't want to do quaint commentary or stuff like that. So I think in terms of who is actually more of a threat, I see news gathering and information is more vital and more needed for the church than trite social commentary by the Gospel Coalition. And not only do I check their American version, I also look at their overseas versions, specifically the English-speaking languages, but I will occasionally look at the other. Like, I wanted to see if the Gospel Coalition would speak out about the Dutch farmers revolting. But no, the Netherlands, the Dutch Gospel Coalition website, very inactive. They don't publish a whole lot. They are extremely silent on salient social issues. And that I think is a new development for the Gospel Coalition.
Yeah, I mean, I see like 5 ways to maintain unity and disagreement. I mean, it's just doing a Tim Keller third wayism type thing. How to, like, a lot of, I mean, very trite stuff. But yeah, on their whole page, they don't really have a whole lot of hot takes that are like hot off the press.
So think we should wrap it up. But if you want to support the Evangelical Dark Web, evangelicaldarkweb.org/join is where you can go. We have a snap poll that you can vote on if you're a subscriber or a member at Evangelical Dark Web on Church Villain of the Year. There's 3 or 4 options there. We got Bart Barber, Rachel Den Hollander, Tim Keller, and Rick Warren are your 4 options you can vote on. There's also an other column. Please, if you do other, I believe you can leave a comment below, but that is a behind the paywall type of art snap poll that I'm trying to do just to kind of interact with you guys on a different level. So if you're interested, that's my enticement for today. Otherwise, like the video, leave comments as well. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that. If you're still watching and haven't subscribed, what are you doing? Otherwise, we will catch you on the next one. Have a blessed day.